Hello, a very warm good evening to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the international edition of today's The Hindu newspaper and extract the important articles relevant for your examination, be it for the prelims or the mains. So, today in total, we are going to have a coverage of 8 different topics. Five of them in slightly greater detail associated with the mains examination. We will be having an analytical view of that, and three of them relevant for the prelims purpose and prelims examination in general. So, first of all, the topic which has appeared in the editorial section of the newspaper: green steel can shape India's climate goals trajectory. Now, green steel has been in discussion for a few years now, and Indian government has also declared various different policy measures. But then, when it comes to green steel, why we cannot afford to lag behind. So that is something which is relevant for your GS paper 3 and is very important for the examination as well. Then the 27th Amendment, Pakistan's democratic dilemma. Now, this is about the kind of democratic upheaval which our Western neighboring country, Pakistan, is facing. But we will not delve too much into the country of Pakistan in itself. We will try to understand the larger aspect of the rule of law and why it is important for the courts to function independently. Otherwise, the entire idea of democracy that gets shallower. So this is relevant for your GS paper 2. Labor intensive sectors to benefit from India EU FTA deal. Now, this is something vital. It is a follow up to the discussions that we were having and you have been receiving about the India EU FTA. So, the labor intensive sector, how they can benefit from it. Now, high tap coverage under the Jal Jeevan scheme, but lower usage. Now, a survey has been carried out about the Jal Jeevan mission, and it has found various different kind of results. In certain areas, the coverage is more. In certain areas, the availability of purer water is even less. So, with the help of this, we will take a larger view at what does Jal Jeevan mission indicate, what is that mission overall, and that can be important for your examination. This is also relevant for your GS paper 3. Then, menstrual health is integral to the right of life. The Supreme Court has basically carried out a ruling whereby it has put menstrual health under Article 21A, right to life. So, what are the court's rulings with regards to that? Relevant for your GS paper 2. Stem cell therapy. Now, Supreme Court has basically said that stem cell therapy cannot be offered as a clinical cure for autism. And that is where it has pulled up the government and various different private clinics for doing so. But we are going to take a look at what do we understand by that stem cell therapy overall. FPI outflows at a 5-month high, and quality control is established via markets and not via QOCs. That is a statement by the chief economic advisor. So these are the topics that we are going to have a detailed look at. But before we move ahead into the first topic, an announcement for all of you preparing for the examination or thinking about preparing for the examination. Now, today we have the last day of the offer, 60% off for CSE Assure, 18 months for the 18-month subscription and above. And use the code IAS English. And what is the CSE Assure? In case if you have a subscription of 18 months and above, in case for some reason or the other you are not able to clear the examination in certain conditions, then your next attempt is on us. So that is something that you can avail. Take a look and use the code. Now, having said that, we come to the first topic of the day: green steel can shape India's climate goals trajectory. Now, when we talk about steel sector is always considered to be as one of the backbone for overall infrastructure in any particular region. Historically, we have seen that whichever country has developed has been on the back of the growth of the iron and steel sector. In fact, the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the European powers has also been on steel sector. Then in the modern day and age, you can take the example of US, Japan, China. All of them have done extraordinarily well when it comes to steel. India is amongst one of the larger producers of steel in the world. But then our requirement for steel is going to increase by almost three times in the next couple of decades. So our consumption demands are so high. Why? Because as a country which is developing, we need more power plants, we need more highways, we need more flyovers, we need more railways, we need more airports. For all of these infrastructure building, steel is something which is very much required. Now, when you take a look at this steel sector, while it is important and it provides a lot of employment to a larger population, steel is also a sector which emits substantial amount of carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalent in the entire production process. As a consequence of this, it is not considered to be eco-friendly. And India, overall, when it comes to the commitments as per the Paris Agreement, India has committed to reduce the carbon intensity of the GDP by almost around 45%. Now, that is the goal that India has stated on the global forum. Now, this cannot be carried out unless and until steel as a sector in itself is decarbonized. That is where the concept of green steel comes into the picture. What is this concept of green steel? We will take a look into. Okay. But first of all, when we talk about the overall emissions carried out by steel, so the steel sector alone is responsible for close to around 12% of countries' emissions. Right. 12%, which is significantly higher. Okay. Now, when you think about it, presently our production is roughly close to around 125 million tons. Okay. Still lesser than China. But by mid century, that is roughly by 2050, our production will be almost as per the requirement. The requirement will be that of 400 million tons. So that means a substantial capacity expansion. That means we need to have more steel plants. The existing steel plants need to increase their capacity. We need to produce more. Now, the traditional method of production of steel in that you burn coal. Coal is first of all pulverized. It is converted into very tiny powdered form, and then it is undergone combustion. Then it undergoes combustion. Now, after that, obviously heat is produced, and in the blast furnace, that is when the iron ore pellets they are heated and the impurities are removed, and you have the iron which is extracted. Now, in the entirety of the process, whenever you burn coal, you are carrying out emission. And for iron, you need greater amount of heat, so more amount of coal is also burned. So overall, the industrial sector is very polluting in this particular segment. If we are expanding the capacity to almost three times by 2050, that means the amount of pollution that we are going to carry out is also going to be humongous. But let's suppose we ignore the environment. Let's suppose we ignore our overall commitments that we have done. For example, when we talk about our global commitments, as per the Paris Agreement, as per the Paris Agreement, it was basically at Conference of Parties number 26, which was held in Glasgow. At that Conference of Parties, basically India declared its Panchamrit, India's Panchamrit, right? The five goals for climate fight against the climate change. Now, amongst one of those goals was to reduce carbon intensity of the GDP, intensity of GDP to 45%. So that basically means that the contribution of those sectors which are emitting, which are polluting, which actually end up emitting a lot of carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalents into the atmosphere, that will be reduced. Now, let's suppose this climate commitment also you put to the side, right? Let's suppose the pollution and the climate aspect you put to the side. But the reality of the matter is that the present day world, they are not ready to accept steel which is formed or which is made out of the polluting process. The world in itself is transitioning towards green steel. One of the largest manufacturers, and in fact, the largest manufacturers of steel, that is China. Now, China, for a few years now, has been transitioning into the green steel market and also increased the capacity of the recycling of the steel, the scrap industry, right? So, when you have a well matured scrap industry where the scrap materials are basically collected and then they are reutilized to manufacture steel, obviously the amount of energy which is required is lesser. So already in that particular case of circular economy, you have lesser emissions which are being carried out. So China is reinvigorating the scrap industry at a massive, unprecedented scale, which is almost unparalleled across the world. Along with that, China is also infusing the aspect of green steel. So this is where they are taking an edge. Other than that, when you consider the region of Europe, Europe for the past couple of decades has been trying to decarbonize the steel industry, right? So the process of decarbonization has been carried out or is being carried out for the past 2 decades. Now, in this decarbonizing of steel industry does involve higher technological prowess and at the same time a matured renewable energy sector. Now that Europe is sure of able to manufacture steel with lesser amount of emissions, that is where Europe has actually imposed the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM. What is this CBAM? It is like a tax. It is like a tariff. So let's suppose when we talk about Europe, Europe has industry standards that it has set that you cannot emit more than this in production process. You cannot emit more carbon dioxide than this in the production process. So they are following environmental regulation. So obviously the cost of production can be higher. Now, if let's suppose you talk about a country like Vietnam or a country like India. Now, in our country, the environmental standards and the environmental regulations are much more diluted, much more weaker. So, in our country, the cost of production is comparatively lesser. Now, if India exports its steel to Europe, Europe will lose the competitive advantage. So that is why what Europe is doing is that any inputs coming from or any imports coming from those markets which don't have a very stringent environmental regulation, they will be taxed. That is why it is known as border adjustment mechanism, carbon border adjustment mechanism. Okay. Now, this is a kind of a protective tariff. Okay. Here, a kind of an import duty will be created. Now, as a consequence of that, Indian steelmakers will lose out because in India, environmental regulations are not so high. And also, if environmental regulations are not so high, chances are that majority of the steel makers they wouldn't be following the absolute best method of production of steel, right? They would be compromising. They would still be using coal. So that is why the article basically is arguing that look, the world is changing. Even if we don't want to move, the world is moving towards green steel. So why not we take the step also? And all the other countries have already taken good amount of leap. So we should also take that urgent step. We should also move towards green so that over a period of time, Indian steel can actually be required in the global market. We can fulfill the demand of the global market and we will not be left out of the entire steel sector. So that is what the entire article is about. But first of all, what do we understand by green steel? So when we talk about green steel, in this particular case, yeah, we basically have the case where this green steel is manufactured with the help of renewable steel manufacturing process with the help of renewables. Okay, with the help of renewables. Okay, now what happens under the normal process? Try to understand that first. Under the normal process, for example, when you talk about the iron ore concentrate, it is first of all converted into iron ore pellets. Now, for that, fossil fuels like coal, etc., is used. When you convert that iron ore concentrate into pellets, pellets mean small sized particles. So, there, fossil fuel is used, carbon dioxide is emitted. Now, after that, when it goes for the iron making, at that point of time, for example, coking coal is used in the blast furnace. The coking coal is pulverized in the blast furnace, high temperatures are attained, and then steel is manufactured. So, in this also, carbon dioxide is emitted. After that, the hot metal, that is where eventually there also you have the CO2 which is emitted. Now, this is the case of the normal steel manufacture. What is the condition of a green steel? So you use renewable energy right from the time when you want to convert iron into the iron ore pellets. You use renewable energy. Okay. Then that renewable energy which you have been using, you basically use the hydrogen, water, etc. Or basically, how do you produce hydrogen? For example, green hydrogen by electrolysis. By electrolysis of H2O, you are able to separate hydrogen and oxygen. So that is where you can use that hydrogen as a fuel instead of fossil fuel, instead of coking coal, to convert that into the process of iron manufacturing. So the emission will be, rather than CO2, emission will be water vapor. So overall, the emissions are being reduced. And then with the help of the scrap, that is how the recycling, the scrap, you are able to manufacture the eventual steel and the sponge iron. So at various different stages, you are ensuring that there is no emission of carbon dioxide at all. So this is done how? With the help of green hydrogen in particular. This can be done by green hydrogen. Okay. Now, how do you produce that green hydrogen? With the help of renewables, you carry out electrolysis of water, whereby you are able to separate hydrogen and oxygen, right? So, electrolysis of water, electrolysis of water. So, that is where basically you will observe that H2 and O2 are separated. Now, this is used. Then, other than that, for the final production process, scrap metal. Okay. So then you are able to produce green steel, which is eco-friendly in terms of the production of carbon dioxide does not happen. Now, that is the overall process. Now, the global scenario, now global markets overall have been increasingly rewarding the low carbon steel products. China is scaling up scrap based steel making and green hydrogen integration. European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism penalizes carbon intensive steel export. So we don't have any kind of global market which is over a period of time, over a next couple of decades, which will still be manufacturing the polluting method of steel. Now, having said that, our requirements are high. Domestic requirements are also high. But at the same time, we will be setting up newer plants. So that is what the article argues, that there is no point of setting up any new plant which does not have the modern methodology of production. Meanwhile, you have the existing plants also which are trying hydrogen infusion in certain cases. For example, Jindal Steel is trying that. In certain cases, there is the case of scrap being used, but it is at a very limited scale. Overall, still, the barriers to the green steel that our country faces are humongous. What are the barriers? Limited supply and the high cost of green hydrogen. We still don't have the infrastructure for large scale utilization of green hydrogen. Then, insufficient renewable energy, which is dedicated to the industry. Renewable energy, the capacity has been increasing, right? And the capacity has been scaled up quite substantially. But much of that capacity is still not sequenced to the grid. And as a consequence, the reliable energy to the industry that is not provided. Because please understand, when we talk about renewables, one of the problem with renewables is what? That they are patchy. They are not very continuous, as is the case with the coal powered thermal plant and so on. So we need very good battery storage unit, and there also we are lacking. A few days ago we talked about that how India's overall initiative when it comes to the chemical cell PLI scheme, that backfire, or that is not something which is working so well. We are not able to manufacture those battery cells in our own country to such an extent. So our storage units are not there. Unless and until we have large dedicated storage cells, renewable capacity will and renewable energy will not be something which the industry will utilize on the large scale. So that is another issue. Limited availability and informal nature of the scrap market. We don't have a kind of a well organized scrap market where all the steel etc you still find it to be present and dumped into the various dump yards etc. So that is why we don't have that. That needs to be established. Consistent and assured availability of reasonably priced natural gas. Why natural gas is mentioned here? Because you see, immediately we won't be able to switch to green hydrogen. It is a time taking process, right? So if we are not able to switch to green hydrogen immediately rather than coal, the transition should be with natural gas, so that at least the amount of emissions are less. So natural gas here, when it is mentioned, it is a kind of a transition transition fuel from coal coal to hydrogen. Okay. Then identification and development of natural carbon sinks for sequestration. That is also, we need to identify that. Only then we will be able to achieve carbon neutrality at least. Then lack of long maturity, low cost debt for green steel projects. What does that mean? So when you have to establish a new industrial setup for manufacturing of green steel, it is a very capital intensive business. It cannot be done with small amount of fund. You need large amount of fund. But that large amount of fund needs to be available at a cheaper interest, at a cheaper cost. So that is where you don't have so many funds available in our country, as is the case with Europe. Those funds are easily available. In fact, in Europe, nowadays, for any funding mechanism that you go to, if it is doing with renewables, if it is doing with climate change, the funding is easy. So that is one of the issues and some of the barriers that Indian steel faces when it comes to transition to green. Now, why urgency is required? We have discussed this. The urgency is required because we will be left behind in the global race, and the global market won't accept our steel anymore. And steel is something, the steel sector is something which is not completely, we have a large domestic demand also, but benefits from exports, right? Benefits from export. Now, if let's suppose European market and eventually the other market also bring about these kind of non-tariff barriers for us, that means what? The steel export will go down, right? The steel export goes down. Now, when the steel export goes down, that means the amount of manufacturing will go down, right? Not only will it have uh, the impact in the industry, but across multiple industries. Why? Because steel also requires high amount of labor force. So that is where unemployment cycle can be kicked up. Unemployment. Now, also understand, if the steel manufacturing goes down, then another sector which gets impacted is the mining sector. The mining sector, which is also labor intensive, that also experiences a decline. Okay. And this will also lead to further unemployment. And this twin effect of unemployment can always lead to reduction of demand, the economy. And overall, there will be a loss in GDP as well. So that is why we need our steel to be present and to be competitive across the global market. Now, there are some policy initiatives which have been there in the which have been initiated by the government of India. For example, the greening steel roadmap, the green steel taxonomy that formalizes definitions, which Indian government is one of the first in the world to do so. Then, even when we talk about the carbon credit trading scheme, there also the emission trading, etc. But in all of this, we have an issue. The issue is that the government requires, or the government is required to lay down that broader infrastructure for renewables, for hydrogen storage, etc. That cannot be done by a steel maker on its own, while captive energy can be generated. But we need to decarbonize other sectors also, like cement, etc. So that is where the government can invest through the PSUs. Through the PSUs, the government can invest in large scale clean hydrogen manufacturing, and there we can utilize the untapped renewable energy that we have. Right? So that is the kind of a way forward. That is the infrastructure setup that we need to do. That is where we need the government support. Then the funding needs to be available, and the existing capacity needs to be renovated. Only then the newer capacity can always be augmented. Okay, let's take a look at the practice question. What is green steel? Why is it important for India to increase its role in global green steel market? So, here, what is so in this the intro? It is a direct, straightforward question. Intro, you talk about the fact that what is green steel? Steel manufacturing, whereby the entire process entails a eco-friendly method of manufacturing, whereby in the entire process you use renewables, hydrogen, green hydrogen, etc., and reduce the overall emissions. So that is where you can talk about the definition. Ideally, after the intro in the body, draw the schematic diagram as well, right? A small schematic diagram that will be more than sufficient. After that, why is it important for India? So let's suppose this is for 10 marks. Why is it important for India to increase its role in global green steel market? That is because that when we talk about India, and we have to here mention about the global scenario, right? Global scenario. Then you have to talk about Indian steel being incompetitive or uncompetitive, Indian steel being left out, and then also the case of how GDP will be impacted, impact on GDP. Okay, all these things you mention, and then eventually you conclude that it is also imperative for India. Here, you also have to mention the case of the climate, climate commitment. Okay, commitment. That also has to be mentioned. Okay. So here, basically, this is where you can conclude by saying that transitioning to green steel not only makes our workforce future ready, but also ensures that economy is much more resilient, and the transition to the low carbon economy and carbon neutral economy gets much smoother. Like that, you can conclude in a direct way. The 27th Amendment, Pakistan's democratic dilemma. Now, what this article is about? This article is basically an article talking about how Pakistan as a country has basically brought in the 27th Amendment Act to the Constitution, which was initially brought about for a kind of a military rule and giving the a kind of a lifetime immunity to the field marshal and so on, but ended up diluting the powers of the Supreme Court as well. The Supreme Court, which was very instrumental in providing various different judgments, for example, the Panama Gate and so on, the Memo Gate, etc. Now, that Supreme Court, its powers were diluted and power was divested into a federal court. Now, ideally, you can have multiple courts in the country, and that is fine. But the appointment of judges in the federal court was also something which was not very transparent. As a consequence, multiple judges of the Pakistan Supreme Court, they actually did resign. But we are not going to talk about what is happening in Pakistan right now, because Pakistan polity is important for your exam. But why have we considered this article? This because this article talks about the global scenario which is being played out across the world. Particularly when we take a look at South Asia, you take a look at Pakistan, you take a look at Nepal, you take a look at Bangladesh. The countries are in huge amount of turmoil. And that is when there is a kind of a temptation with the people in power to concentrate more power in their hands. The only check and the only balance that they have is the judiciary. And the judiciary cannot be compromised. The moment the judiciary is compromised, at that point of time, you can have an assurance that democracy gets up. And that is where Dicey's and argument, A.V. Dicey's argument about rule of law is also cited here. Now, rule of law is very, very important. And that is where you need the independence of the judiciary and the independence of. And the article actually quotes about it that it started in the 17th century. In the 17th century, you basically had one of the kings of England, that is King James I. King James I proclaimed that, look, I am the sovereign and I can adjudicate disputes. After all, I am the sovereign. I have all the power. I can take care and resolve all the disputes out there. That is when, at that point of time, the then Chief Justice, Edward Coke, he said that no, you are not subject, you are basically also subject to the judicial jurisprudence. You will not be adjudicated. So, since 17th century itself, you had the argument about the independence of judiciary. Now, this is where India can have a cautionary tale. Okay, that is what the article argues, that India is not something, or India is not a country which should compare itself to Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. But we can take a cautionary note out of it. So the context of it, in November 2024, Pakistan passed the 27th constitutional amendment and the presidential order was given. Now, it was initially presented as an administrative order to reorganize the aspects of the military command, but reduce the central role of Pakistan's Supreme Court. It transferred the original jurisdiction over constitutional interpretation, fundamental rights, and even federal provincial disputes to newly created federal constitutional. So the entire role of Supreme Court had been diluted. Now, in the region of South Asia, we are seeing power upheavals in multiple different countries. Take the case of Nepal, take the case of Bangladesh, take the case of Pakistan, right? Everywhere. In all these areas where this power upheaval is happening, you will find a common factor. The common factor is that those who actually hold or wield some power, they want to concentrate the power around them. So there is the temptation to concentrate the power, temptation to control and concentrate power. Now, when you need to do this, and why do you need to concentrate power? How do they uh, basically justify to the public, and how do they convince the public that power should be vested with them? They do that overall with the kind of aspirations that the population has, the grievances that the population has, and also some of the failings that the overall administrative setup might have experienced. That is how they are able to, in a way, convince the larger population that, okay, it's okay if I get more power because I am going to do much more good. But eventually, what happens? In this particular case, when you have the temptation to concentrate power, there's a tussle between executive, and judiciary. Judiciary is under a lot of pressure. And that is where the independence of the judiciary is something which is challenged. In cases like Pakistan, it has been diluted. And that is when all the power is with the military executive. Similarly, in Bangladesh also, the judiciary is under immense amount of pressure. That is where you will observe the rulings that it has carried out in the past year and a half, extremely partisan in nature that they are, owing to the larger public pressure also. So this is something which is going on across and around us. This is where the article argues that look, rule of law and A.V. Dicey's concept of rule of law does tell us about the role of independence of judiciary. As per A.V. Dicey, the rule of law, a doctrine premised on the absence of arbitrary power, because eventually executive will keep on gaining more power, accumulating more power, and that is where arbitrariness comes in. And eventually it can lead to authoritarianism. Then, equality before law, the must, and the central role of independent courts as sentinels of the right, upholders of the rights of the people. That is where you need independent courts. In Dicey's conception, the law exists to restrain authority, with courts serving as the institutional bridge between power and liberty. So basically, when we talk about courts, their independence is, and that is where for India, it is a cautionary tale, not a comparison tale. Why? Where, when we talk about the region of Europe, for example, Europe between the two world wars, it turned into authoritarianism and it turned into fascism. It was not because some dictator took over. It was not because suddenly there was a coup, a military coup which happened. No. Europe turned towards a very authoritarian regimes in a very legitimate how. You had elections which were held. The elections decided the outcome. Now, these elections, the people who were elected in power, after that, they carried out the so called reforms. Reforms. Why? Reforms in order to ensure the better power distribution and reforms in order to ensure faster action. Right? So, reforms for faster actions. As a consequence of this, these set of reforms, what happened? Judiciary lost importance, lost relevance. And that is when you basically had the people in power were able to concentrate the power. In power became much more dominant. Okay? They became much more dominant. And that is when overall you had the concentration and Europe turning into authoritarian regime. So that is the cautionary tale that India also has to take going ahead into the future, that come what may, independence of judiciary is non-negotiable regardless of what happens, because that is what deepens the root of democracy, and in the name of reform we cannot make the democracy shallower. Okay, now this is an article which has appeared in the form of an interview, that is labor intensive sectors to benefit from EU-India free trade agreement. Now there were wide ranging questions which were basically put to Piyush Goyal, one of the key movers and shakers for this FTA deal. But having said that, we are not going to take a look into all the questions and all the answers which are there. We are going to take a look into the broader understanding. So, labor intensive sectors such as textiles, apparels, footwear, gems, jewelry, leather, and light manufacturing, they will be amongst the biggest gainers when it comes to the FTA deal with Europe. Why? Because the duty structure which will be created, that will be much lower. Having said that, the article or the entire interview also talks about the fact that there is a greater eagerness on the side of the Europeans also to implement this FTA by this year itself. Mind you, the precedence is that EU signed a free trade deal with Mercosur nations in 2019. 2019. It has not been finalized even now. In 2025, that trade deal was dragged into the courts owing to the agricultural disputes. So that is where the doubts are being raised, because once you sign the deal, then it has to be ratified by the government, and you need to have the parliamentary approval. The European nations also need to approve that. Okay, only then will the deal be implemented. I hope everybody is aware that signing the deal does not mean the implementation of the deal. Implementation of the deal is still many, many months away. Right now, the minister basically argued that look, many of the European nations, including France, and in fact initiated by France, they want the deal to be actually translated into 24 languages so that all the member parliaments can actually approve that of the European Union. And that is where France is leading the agenda. The hope is that it will be implemented this year itself, finalized this year itself. Once it is finalized, then you will have a duty structure which will be created where many of the labor intensive industries, they will face a kind of a zero tariff or a very reduced tariff. Now these labor intensive sectors can benefit out of it, and mind you, labor intensive means what? Each of them, they have a large amount of employment opportunity, large amount of people, they are working in these particular industries. And amongst these labor intensive industries, for example, if you consider textile, if you consider apparel, if you consider gems and jewelry, these are the sectors which were impacted substantially, and which are being impacted due to the US tariffs on India. US has imposed close to 50% tariffs on India. So that is where these sectors are heavily impacted. There's a lot of hiring and firing which is going on in these particular sectors. So those sectors will benefit. Now, in regions or in markets such as the apparel, merchandise exports, the clothing apparels, etc., India has been losing ground over the years to Bangladesh, to Vietnam, to Korea for that matter, to Pakistan, and so on. That is where the argument by the minister is that if, let's suppose, the duty structure is less as per the deal, then our market share will increase, our overall exports will increase, and it will be much more beneficial, not only for employment creation, but overall the trade balance of the country. So these sectors employ large number of semi-skilled and unskilled workers. See, skilled workers, they are still able to find meaningful jobs here or there. But it is the unskilled and the semi-skilled workers where the unemployment hits hard, right? So that is where the FTA can be employment augmenting. Out of the estimated $35 billion export opportunity, around $33.5 billion will face zero duty from day one when this is implemented. So that is one of the major advantages that the FTA actually carries. Now, the minister was also inquired about carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, carbon border adjustment mechanism was one of the sticking points while finalizing the deal. After all, Indian steel makers will suffer, but the Europeans are not ready to budge on that. That is where the minister actually argued that we are trying to find a common ground in the case of those areas, in those sectors where we will benefit. Okay. Now, then we come to the Jal Jeevan scheme. Now, high type coverage under the Jal Jeevan scheme, but lower usage and reliability. Now, Har Ghar Jal scheme was initiated in around 2019, right, by Ministry of Jal Shakti. Now, in this particular case, almost 98% of the rural households have been covered by the Har Ghar Jal scheme. 98% of the rural household. Now, that is good in a way because, see, you need pipe drinking water supply. A country cannot aspire to develop unless and until you still have population who walks miles for the search of water. So piped water is essential. If you provide piped water, then the groundwater depletion which is happening at an alarming rate, that will also reduce, excuse me, that will also reduce. Along with that, you will also have the case where many people drinking contaminated water, they suffer from non-communicable diseases, for example, even communicable diseases in certain cases. So the out-of-pocket health expenditure that the population incurs, that can also be saved ever so slightly. So there are a lot of benefits associated with pipe drinking water supply. That is why the Ministry of Jal Shakti had initiated the Har Ghar Jal program. We will take a look at what this Har Ghar Jal program is. But now, there have been periodic surveys which have been carried out. The recent survey which has been carried out indicates that the coverage is almost 98%. Right? Now, having said that, overall, when you talk about Tripura, right, majority of the states, they reported the 85% satisfaction with water quality, except Tripura. Tripura, the water quality was not good. In many of the regions, even the fecal matter was less than desirable. The fecal matter standards, so to say, that is, the water had greater amount of fecal content as what is considered to be safe. So the water is unsafe in many of the areas, and you don't have adequate reliable supply also in many of the regions. So that is basically the result of the survey. You don't need to learn the survey, you don't need to memorize this survey, you don't need to have the detailed outlook. You need to look into what is the Har Ghar Jal mission. So what is this Har Ghar Jal mission? Launched in 2019, mission aims to provide functional household tap connection, with each household being provided with 55 liters of water minimum to all rural households, ensuring adequate, safe, and affordable drinking water. Implemented by the Ministry of Jal Shakti and the Department of Drinking Water and Sanitation. Now, targets over 19 crore rural households across India, focuses on last mile service delivery, minimum service level of 55 liters per capita per day. So, per capita, per individual, you need to have 55 liters of water. Potable water quality, including chemical and bacteriological safety. And that is where safety checks would be carried out with the help of various different instruments. Encourages village level water supply systems. Now, the funding, center state cost sharing, overall basically is 50-50. And for the Himalayan states and the northeastern states, it is 90-90 pattern. Okay, so that is the requirement for your examination when it comes to Har Ghar Jal mission. Okay, now promotes Gram Panchayat ownership, village water and sanitation committees. They will be ensuring greater participation and greater implementation, and their use of Internet of Things sensors, GIS mapping, and real time dashboards with the help of the field test kits to measure the quality of water. It is in these field test kits it was found out that the fecal matter in many of the regions are more than desirable. Okay, so just for the examination purpose, take a look at Har Ghar Jal program. Now, after that, coming on to the next article, that is menstrual health. Menstrual health in schools is integral to right to life. Now, the Supreme Court has basically argued and has provided the ruling that when we talk about the menstrual health and menstrual health hygiene, now in that particular case, it is very important for the girls to be provided with the assurance of the menstrual health. In the schools, in the colleges, in the institutions where they don't have that assured privacy, that safety, as a consequence, many of them, they basically they disenroll or they don't come to schools anymore. And this is where the court has highlighted that each and every school, in the ruling, it has said that each and every school must have and must provide adequate amount of measures for ensuring this menstrual health, including sanitary napkins, biodegradable sanitary napkins, through disposal machines in the washrooms, a separate functioning washroom and toilet for girls and for boys. And then, along with that, you also need to provide better awareness to the boys also and to the male members so that they are aware about the menstrual health cycles, and that has been included under right to life. Okay, so here Supreme Court of India held that menstrual health and access to menstrual health management, MHM, in schools forms the integral part of the right to life and dignity under Article 21 of the Constitution. Now, what is the ruling? All schools, government and private, urban and rural, must provide free access to sanitary napkins, preferably within the toilets through disposal machines, vending machines. Schools are directed to ensure functional, gender segregated toilets, adequate water supply, and safe disposal mechanism. Now, menstrual health management was broadened to privacy also, not only the provision of these sanitary napkins, but even privacy, then decisional autonomy and bodily integrity. Then, states and UTs were directed to set up MHM corners equipped with spare uniforms, innerwear, disposal bags. And now, this is linked to Article 21A. Emphasizing social change, court stressed the role of educating the boys and sensitizing them with and even the male teachers to prevent harassment. Okay, in case any of the school or the government school is found to be non-compliant, then they may attract accountability, while private schools risk derecognition under the Right to Education Act. So this is the overall issue that they will, and a kind of a punitive measure that they will face. Okay, now some articles relevant for your prelims. Stem cell therapy cannot be offered as clinical service for autism. Now, Supreme Court came down heavily on the government and also on some of the private clinics which were offering stem cell therapy to treat autism. Now, stem cell therapy is not still approved for various different things in our country. It is still in very much an experimental stage. So that is where many of these clinics, they are charging high amount of money to treat autism by stem cell therapy. Obviously, the success is not there in many of the cases, and you have an aggrieved set of patients. So, that is where we need to understand what is stem cell therapy. So, first of all, what is a stem cell? These are undifferentiated cells with the capacity to both differentiate and multiply into different type of cells in our human body. That is where stem cells research is considered to be of vital importance going ahead into the future. It can take care of diseases like cancer, brain problems, neurological or neurodegenerative issues, and so on. Because a stem cell can also multiply and reform itself as a nerve cell, for example. Right? So it can take care of multiple issues. So the stem cells, they can basically modify themselves into intestinal cells, liver cells, cardiac cells, nerve cells, blood cells, muscle cells. And then they can multiply and they can treat the impacted part of the body. So, in certain areas of the world, this stem cell research is in a slightly mature stage, and in experimental stage, it is being offered as treatment, but only after prior regulations. In our country, we don't have those. So, what is this process of stem cell therapy, by the way? So collection initially from the donor cells, right? From the bone marrow of the donor, some cells are collected, right? Blood is taken from the vein in the patient's arm. Bone marrow is removed under sterile conditions. And after that, it is processed. In the processing, the stem cells are removed and rest of the blood is re-injected back. Then after that, the patient receives the high dose chemotherapy, and eventually after that the stem cells are being received and then it multiplies. Infusion into the patient, the donor stem cells are put back into the patient through a catheter placed in the blood vessel. So that is the process of stem cell treatment. Okay, now then coming to the next article, FPI outflows at a 5-month high of 35,000 crores. Now, the foreign portfolio investors, overall, it has been found out from the sovereigns of Japan and Luxembourg, they have been selling the investment and the portfolio that they have in our country, right? And they are basically selling those. And as a consequence, you will find that the stock market is also very volatile owing to the FPI selling which is happening. Now, why is this selling happening? It is in fact, last year, Indian stock market was amongst the bad performing stock markets across the world in the large economies owing to the FPI selling. So why is that FPI selling happening? Owing to multiple factors. One of the factor is where many of the firms are still considered to be overvalued. So overvaluation is an issue, but it is not the only issue because multiple firms across the world, they are overvalued. For example, if you take a look at the AI firm in US, many of them are basically valued for hundreds of billions of dollars without any revenue stream, but still investment is in our country, investment is being pulled out. Why? Because in today's day and age, majority of the investments are going into those areas which are tech driven, AI. Now in India, we are lagging in AI, right? So India as a market is lagging in AI. As a consequence, the FPIs are not very interested in Indian market right now. Now they are investing in those countries. For example, when you take a look at the Chinese market, now China has provided stimulus over the last year, and even this year it is expected to provide another set of fiscal stimulus. So as a consequence of that, investment is happening in US and China. US and China. It is because of these areas and these reasons that they are pulling out. Also, over the past few weeks, the sell has also been very high, owing to the case of a kind of a moderate and little amount of earning by MSME. So, as a consequence, the FPIs are not very bullish on India and they have been selling it out. That is where the budget is something where the world is having a keen eye on, taking a look at what the budgetary provisions will be. Okay. Now, then after that, basically, we come to the last topic and the last article. Quality output is established via market, not QCO. Now, a few weeks back, the government initiated a reform, and that was basically to withdraw the QCO order. What is QCO? Quality Control Order. Now, this QCOs, they are a limiting factor in terms of the kind of license that various different markets or various different industries have in terms of achieving the export parameters. Now, it was always considered to be a kind of a barrier by the domestic industries, and they would never be able to compete with the global market. Now, the chief economic advisor has pointed out certain things, and two of the aspects are mentioned in this. Now, the chief economic advisor has pointed out that look, when we talk about the quality, if any particular product is of a good quality or not, it is not something that a QCO will decide. If it is of a good quality, globally demand will be there. For example, I take this pen. If the pen is of poor quality, nobody will buy that. So that good will automatically suffer. If it is of a good quality, you don't need a QCO order for this in order to make it acceptable. Right? So market dynamics should play. That is one of the, and governmental control should be reduced. That is one of the message which has been provided. The other message which has been provided is that, and that is something that the economic survey has also raised as a question, is that the cash stimulus which is given by the states, or the cash doleouts which is given by the states during election time, that is not healthy. Overall, as a country, we have managed to almost half our fiscal deficit. But when it comes to the states, that is where the fiscal health is turning out to be really bad. Many of the states are over leveraged due to the cash transfer that they give. Okay, so that is all that you need to know for this particular article. And over a period of time, this will evolve, and you would have gone through the summary of the economic survey as well. That brings us to the end of the discussion for the day. I hope the discussion was something which has added some amount of information to your existing knowledge set. Do revise, do try to write the answer as well. Do attempt the quiz on the Telegram channel. If you have liked the content, put that in the comment, and don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.